Defying all odds, freedom was now a reality. For the first time in centuries, they are finally out of reach from all the whips and blows forcing them to build the Egyptian empire. And the pursuing army attempting to recapture them, God cast into the sea. This newly formed nation of Hebrews was now ready to take on the unique cosmic mission Yahweh had specifically created for them. They are to embody the presence of Eden until the promised Messiah would reclaim it and defeat the powers of evil. But this task will be anything but easy, with countless pitfalls to avoid. So in preparation for this supernatural battle, Yahweh gave them some rules of engagement as they are now tasked with guarding Eden.
Well, welcome everyone. I'm glad that you're here with us tonight, both in the room and online. It's great where we're at the place we're getting ready to move almost into the promised land as we're following the Israelites through on their journey. And so we're on our Epic of Eden through the year and how the Bible's one continuous story, and it's all about how God is reclaiming the sacred space where humans and God can dwell together in all of his beauty. And that's what Jesus did on the cross. And there's going to be a new Eden coming, which is awesome. There is a new sacred space that's going to be coming in the new heaven and earth. So with that being said, if you like to follow along and do like the sermon notes thing, you can go here, do digital notes. I got links and stuff in there. If you're kind of newer and you want to catch up to where we've been, I'm actually working on putting together this in like a written document. Somebody asked me like, hey, you going to put this into a book? And I'm like, no, there's great books out there. And they're like, no, I want to read this book. And so I'm actually working on putting it in there. And I got a link in there you can read in if you want to catch up with where we're at. Starting at the very beginning, working our way in. So with that being said, I'm going to pray, and then we're going to jump into tonight's text. So dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for this great story, the greatest story in all of humanity, of how it's not just like the Bible's not just a book of rules. It's not just a cosmic what-to-do list, but it's actually this story of how even though humanity decided to break everything and chase after evil spiritual beings, that you're reclaiming it, and you've broke the power of sin, and how Christ can come and act into our lives. Like he came into this world, his death, burial, and resurrection, and he can come into our lives and transform us. So God, I pray that as we spend some time looking at the next part of our journey tonight, that you would speak to us and teach us what you want us to know. In your heavenly name, amen. All right, well, have any of you guys ever gotten to move before, right? Like moving day. Who's excited for moving day? Anybody? Nobody's excited about never? Nobody's ever like, whoo, I get to move today. No? I mean, there's like some fun things about it. I got one in the whole group. One person's like excited. Like I remember when I moved to Rapid City and stuff, and it kind of maybe looked a little bit like this. But like moving can be fun. Moving can be terrifying. Moving, you're like going into something maybe unknown. You're going and taking on a new adventure. Maybe you're excited to get away from where you've been and you're going somewhere better. Maybe you're like don't want to leave where you're at and you're going to like not sure what you're getting into, but like moving like is a new transition. It's a new start in life. And one thing I've learned from buying a truck a while back is if you own a truck, by default, it means you're volunteering to help everyone move. And so it's just like, yeah, it's just, I spend a lot of time moving. I'm getting to the place where I'm old enough now that like my back's telling me I don't like moving as much. So anyways, but it's a new beginning. You're going into something new. It has so many challenges, but so many opportunities, so many new adventures. Well, that's the way it is with the Israelites. We're actually at the part of our journey where it's time for them to load up the U-Haul. They're ready to go. They've been waiting years. They're out of the bondage of Egypt, and we left them at Mount Sinai last week, right, talking about some of the laws, and they're getting ready. Like God says, it's time to go. And so tonight I want to look at this big idea that when God calls, God provides. Now, they didn't learn this lesson. And because they didn't learn this lesson, it caused them a lot of problems. And so we're actually going to learn tonight what to do because of what they didn't do, right? We can look at some negative examples in the Bible as maybe like, hey, you failed at this, but maybe we can look at what you should have done. So God, when he calls you on to do something, when he has a task for you, when he's ready for you to go, and it's his leading, he'll provide for you. And it's often very necessary that he does, because the stuff he calls you to do, you can't do on your own. And so now it is time for the Israelites to inherit the land. So this is in Numbers 13. We're going to be looking at Numbers 13 and 14 tonight. But picking up in the story, Numbers 13, 1 and 2. Now the Lord said to Moses, and they're out in the wilderness again, right? Send out men to explore the land of Canaan, the land I'm giving to the Israelites. Send one leader from each of the 12 tribes, the ancestral tribes. For each tribe, pick one person, one leader, and go explore the land I'm getting ready to give to you. Now, that verse raises so many questions. You're like, it does? Yeah, it does. It's like, what, where are they going? What's about this land? The land I'm giving to you, the Israelites. Like, where is this land? Why is it now time? Like, what's with the timetable? What's with this land? Why do they got to go scout it out? Like, maybe if you guys ever went and bought a new house, you went to the town and scouted out the new house to figure out how to move in. Like, my couch is going to fit here. My soda fridge is going to fit here. You got to have the soda fridge, right? Because that's where you keep your soda. But no, there's so many questions about this land specifically. Why does God care about the land he's giving them? And so to do that, we actually have to catch back up in the story. So I'm going to jump back a little bit to make sure we're all up to speed on this land and where they're going. And so up to this point, again, the timeline of where we're at in the Bible, I'm referencing this a lot to keep on track. Again, this is the start of the Bible, 4000 BC. This is the time of Christ. It's a timeline. It moves clockwise around. So this is 0 BC or year 1 AD, something like that. And then it moves around. This is us now. So this is the time of Christ. The ministry of Christ is down here. It moves around. So we start up here, Adam and Eve. We're working our way down. And now I'm going to zoom into this point right down here because that's where we're at. So we've looked at Abraham, and I'm going to reference him real quick. Now we're at Moses and the black lines, the Exodus from Egypt, and they're getting ready to move into the Promised Land. There's 2 names on here if you can read them from there. This is Joshua, and this is Caleb. Those are important. This is Moses and Aaron, if you are familiar with your Bibles a little bit, who they are. So we're going to jump from here real fast, back several hundred years in time to Abraham, and why God cares about this land. What is this the fulfillment of? So this is in Genesis chapter 15, 13 to 19. So if you jump back just a little bit, God's making a promise to Abraham several hundred years before where we're at tonight. And he's telling them this interesting detail that sometimes gets overlooked. But starting in verse 13, God's talking to Abraham, and he's making this covenant with him. And he says, then the Lord said to Abram, you can be sure that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land where they will be oppressed as slaves for 400 years. That's Egypt, right? We looked at that for a while. But I will punish the nation that enslaves them, which he did. And in the end, they will come away with great wealth, which they did. And then he, parentheses, speaking to Abraham, as for you, you will die in peace and be buried at a ripe old age. But after 4 generations, your descendants, or 400 years, your descendants will return here to this land, for the sins of the Amorites do not yet warrant their destruction. Now, what's interesting is when God's telling Abraham this, he's in what's the promised land where they're about ready to go back in. I'll show you a map here in a second. But he says the sins of the Amorites do not yet warrant their destruction. So there's people living here, but they're doing something, and God's upset with them. And he's saying their behavior is going to lead to their destruction. Now, it's not quite there yet. So the Israelites are going to go to Egypt, but they're going to come back. And when they come back, these people are going to be dealt with. So God makes a covenant with them. Verse 18, halfway through 18, he says, I've given this land to your descendants, all the way from the border of Egypt to the great Euphrates River, the land that is now occupied by a bunch of ites, okay? You're like, I don't know who these ites are. There's the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Kadamites, the Hittites, the Pezerites, the Rephaites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Now, has anybody in here ever met one of those people groups? Probably not. That's why you don't know who they are. And you're just like, oh, God's just randomly picking some people, and he's going to just steal their land. That sounds a little harsh until you know what's actually going on in the story. It's important to know that who these people are that keep getting named. And so when you start looking at it, you have to go back to the beginning. So here's the land he's talking about, okay? Egypt is down here. This is the Mediterranean Sea. So this is Egypt down here. Israel, modern-day Israel, still right in here. It's kind of roughly what those colors there are. This is the land area that God promised to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15. He says, your people are going to come down here and go to Egypt, but then they're going to be delivered back out. Now, at the beginning of the world, God created everything, but part of what God created was spiritual beings that were like what we would sometimes call angels. Now, they're actually a little bit different than that, but they're spiritual beings that God created, and he created them good. God created humanity, and together, God loves his creation, wants us to work in this place called Eden, this place where everything works great. That's what Eden was. But the rebellion that happened is some of these spiritual beings said, you know what, we don't want you, God. We don't want to live under your rule. In fact, we want to be our own gods, and we want to completely steal humanity from you. And so they start going after humans and some of the spiritual beings rebel against Yahweh, and it breaks the world in all kinds of ways. And now humanity has been ruled by some of these evil spiritual beings, and they worship them as gods. They're not true gods. God created them, but they're creations of Yahweh that are standing in opposition and rebellion to Yahweh. And then you learn Genesis Genesis chapter 6 that actually some of these spiritual beings came down, they had sex with human women, and they created Nephilim or giants. And the Bible uses several different names for them, different clans. There's the Raphaim, the Nephilim, and several others, the Anakim, and yeah. So there's this hybrid giant being that is in an evil position against God. And so this is the land that they're in right now. And they're actually opposed to Yahweh. They want to do away with him, and they want to do away with God's reclamation process of having God and humanity dwell together. And so God ends up calling Abraham and Sarah out of the people groups, and he says, you know what, you're going to be my people. These people can have their own thing. You can be mine, and then I'm going to launch the plan of Eden through you. And so as we looked at over the last several months, how God has taken them out to Mount Sinai. After he delivered them from Egypt, he gave them the law to protect them, so that way that when they got back into the new land, they wouldn't become like the evil people that God's dispossessing at that point in time. And so now God's actually ready to take them into the land where they're at. So they met with God out in the wilderness, and now they're staged right here in the wilderness, getting ready to go into this promised land. That's where we're at tonight. That's where they're picking up. It is time to go on this mission. Now, this land, though, is still full of people who are in love with rebellious spiritual beings. There's still giants in the land. It's just full of wickedness. And so God says it's time, and he's actually going to deal with the wickedness, kick them out, and bring in the people. So that's what God's promising Abraham way back in Genesis chapter 15, that these people are going to be dealt with. These are all the ites that are there, is that group of rebellious, wicked beings. And so now they are ready for the mission. It is time to get going. And so they're at the place, they don't realize it yet, but they're getting ready to do the impossible. Now, God, when he's calling you, when he's asking you to do something, if you're a follower of God, he will very often ask you to do the impossible. Because if you're trying to do the possible, your dreams aren't big enough. If you're like think you're following God and God's like, hey, you know what? I need you to do like this little tiny thing for me. Like little things are important too, but often like if we just think of like our God dreams are this big, that means you can do it on your own. It's actually probably not a God dream, right? Like when God told us several years ago, hey, you need to start a church. I'm like, God, I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to start a church. And he's like, that's all right. You don't need to know how to do it. I got this, right? Like God said that. Not me got this, but God's got this, right? Like if God's calling you to do something, it's probably bigger than you have any way of pulling off at all on your own. But that just shows that he's the one doing it, not you. And so now God's here, and he's got this impossible task for them to kick out and deal with dispossessing all this evil, dealing with this evil, infection, cancerous, rebellious abomination of creation of what God created as good that's in the land. And so God's saying, now it's time. Now to get ready to go in, send some spies. And that's where we're picking up the story at, is Numbers chapter 13. So if you have your Bible, I'm going to be referencing this as we go through this. It's important to go through. So here they are. God says, time to go into this land. We're going to send some spies. And so Moses does as the Lord's commanded, Numbers 13, 2, or 3. He gets together 12 men. Now, you may know two of them, Joshua and Caleb. And then there's 10 others, and they're listed in here. I can't pronounce some of their names, so I'm not going to even attempt. But you can try to if you want. Verses 4 through 15. So each tribe, each of the 12 tribes of Israel, they get together one leader, and they create this spy coalition, and they're gonna go and check out the new land. So God puts them together. I got 5 here because I didn't know how to put 12 all in one thing. But that represents our 12. They're getting ready, and they go into the land. And so Moses instructs them, verse 17, go out to explore the land, go north through the Negev into the hill country, see what the land is like, and find out whether the people living there are strong or weak, few or many. See what kind of land they live in. Is it good? Is it bad? Do their towns have walls? Are they unprotected? Like open camps? Is their soil fertile or poor? Are there many trees? Do your best to bring back samples of the crops you see, because it happens to be that it's at harvest time and when grapes are coming. So he's like, go check out this land. You know what? Go all the way through, and you probably don't know where all those places are. And so this is like a map of where he tells them to go through. All right? He says, go all the way up, work your way through. They spend 40 days, and they actually work their way through the land. And they're checking out everything, because that's if you're going arguably a military battle, reconnaissance is important, right? So they go in to check it out, and then they come back, and they have news for Moses. 21. So they went and they explored the land in the wilderness. They went north all the way up, kind of summarizing down. Going north, they passed through the Negev, which is an area over here in Israel, and they arrived at Hebron, where Ahiman, Sheshai, Talami, all descendants of Anak lived. The ancient town of Hebron was founded 7 years before the Egyptian city of Zohan. That just gives you some chronological area to know where that city was at. It says, and then they came to the valley of Eshcol. They cut down a branch with a single cluster of grapes so large it took 2 of them to carry on poles between them. Now, that's like pretty big cluster of grapes, right? Like there was so many grapes there that it took 2 of them to be able to carry it. Like that's a massive grape cluster. Like there's a lot of produce going on. This is a good land. They also brought back samples of the pomegranates and figs. That place was called the Valley of Eshcol, which means cluster, because the cluster of grapes the Israelite men cut down. So they came back, they're like, this land has some good stuff. They give a report. 25, after exploring the land for 40 days, the men returned to Moses, Aaron, and the whole community of Israel at Kadesh in the wilderness of Paran, which is down here. They reported to the whole community what they had seen. They showed them the fruit that had been taken from the land, like these big old massive clusters of grapes and everything else. And then it was a report to Moses, we entered the land you sent to us to explore. It was indeed a bountiful country, a land flowing with milk and honey. Now, you might think that sounds kind of sticky, but which it actually kind of does. But milk and honey, like this is a land where there's food you can live off. This is good. The land is great for farming. It produces. Like this is the area that is going to be amazing. Let's go get it, right? Like that's the good report they're bringing back. Now, that's not the whole report they brought back, though, right? Like if it's just that, you're thinking, man, that sounds awesome. This is the land God promised us? Yes, this is the land God promised them. It's going to be good. There's a lot of blessings in with what God is giving them. But again, they have to deal with something that's there. Now, did any of you guys catch what the negative part is in there? Anybody? Maybe you're not familiar because you don't know who Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai are. Like, it's just 3 random names, right? Like, they're going through, there's grapes, like it mentions the grapes, they talk about the milk, the honey. It's a great, amazing land. There's fertile soil. And then there's just 3 descendants of this guy named Anak that are there, Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai. Now, we're not familiar with those names, but that meant something to them. They said, the people living there are powerful. Now, here's the negative report. Their towns are large and fortified. We even saw the giants there, the descendants of Anak. And then you start getting into some of the ites. The Amalekites living in the Negev, the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites lived in the hill country. The Canaanites live along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, along the Jordan Valley. So here they are. They're like, you know what? Yeah, there's some good stuff there, but you don't know what's all there. There's actually some more stuff. There's these guys. They're not just guys. They're giants. They're the descendants of Anak. Now, if you know who the Rephaim are, the Nephilim, and all that, like sometimes we miss that in our Bibles, but it's important. Like one of the things that somebody asked me a while back, which is kind of an interesting thought, is how much is giants part of your theology of the Bible? Right? Like we think like, oh, giants, that seems kind of weird as I'm reading the Bible. We don't talk about that. And for growing up for years in church, I never heard very much about giants other than I know David killed one named Goliath, right? But other than that, what about the giants? But actually to the people who are writing the Bible, giants make up a very, very majority of like the way they interpret Scripture, what they saw as their worldview. And they're saying, yeah, we're going to go into this land, but there's these people here, and they're not just big bad warriors. Yes, they're that. But they're actually like these hybrid human angelic offspring that just kill everything. And if you look at all the other Jewish documents and Mesopotamian documents, we'll read about them in like they're called the Apkallu by the Babylonian documents, and they're like everything in Mesopotamia talks about these people, the giants. But like they're not just like big warriors; they're actually like supernatural hybrid killing machines. They're cannibals, is how they're described. They destroy everything that's near them, and so this land is not just filled with like good stuff. It's filled with these giants, and it's filled with all these people that are aligned with them as giants, and they worship these giants, and they're like it's just horrific. And if we go in there, we're going to be destroyed. So you know what? Let's not do it. And so it comes down to this bad report. But Caleb, remember how Caleb and Joshua were there of the 12? Caleb tried to be quiet, verse 30. Tried to quiet the people as they stood before Moses. He said, you know what? Let's go on to take the land. We can certainly conquer it. He's like, we can do this. We got this. Don't like let this, like God said this is our land. God said this is our mission. In fact, God uniquely put us together as a nation to deal with this. Right? Like there's no other people that God has set together to wipe this out and reclaim Eden. Fix this brokenness. We can do this. Let's go. 31. But the other men who had explored the land with him disagreed. We can't go up against him. They're stronger than we are. So they spread this bad report about the land among the Israelites. The land we traveled throughout and explored will devour anyone who goes there. All the people we saw were huge. We saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. Next to them, we felt like grasshoppers. And you know what? When they looked at us, that's what they thought too. They're like, look at these grasshoppers. We can kill them. So now here's Israel. Are we going to take the you can do it? God said, like, God's going to give you this. Yes, it's impossible. It is absolutely impossible that these nomads, these farmers, these shepherds, like slaves that got out of Egypt, like, are going to do it. Like, they can't do it. These are like battle-hardened warriors. But God called them to do it. It's a crisis of faith moment. You see, if God's going to call you to do something, he's going to empower you. God called them to do this. He's going to empower them to do it. God promised he's going to do it. So what are they going to do? Then the whole community, chapter 14, verse 1. The whole community began weeping aloud, and they cried all night, big babies. I know it's easy for me to say, but I do the same thing, right? Like, God's like, you should do this stuff. God, I don't know how to do this. Their voices rose in a great chorus of protest. That's so poetic. A great chorus of protest. A great protest against Moses and Aaron. And they said, if we'd only died in Egypt, or even here in the wilderness, like, why is the Lord taking us into this country only to have us die in battle? You know, they said that at the Red Sea. They said that all along. Like, God, just kill us off in Egypt, why don't you? Our wives and little ones will be carried off as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to return to Egypt? And then, not only are they whining, they start conspiring. They plotted among themselves, let us choose a new leader to take us back to Egypt. They're like, you know what? We can't do it. We're gonna do more than that. We're gonna silence those voices and let's just turn and run. Let's go back to Egypt. And that's where they left. The two men who had explored the land, Joshua and Caleb, son of Mr. J, tore their clothing. They said to all the people of Israel, the land we traveled through and explored is wonderful. And if the Lord is pleased with us, he will bring us safely into that land and give it to us. It's rich land, flowing with milk and honey. But don't rebel against the Lord. Don't be afraid to the people of the land. They are only helpless prey to us. Like some people are saying, like, this is so impossible. Like, we have no chance but being eaten by these cannibals. And then Joshua, like, we don't have any option but to win. Like, that's not even, like, to lose isn't even on the table. They're helpless prey. Man, there's a difference between the fear and the faith that these two have, right? The fear that one group has and the helpless prey mentality that the other has. Like, if God's calling you to do something, the task he has for you is already helpless prey before him. Like, if he's already got it won. They have no protection, but the Lord is with us. Like, these poor giants, these poor cannibals, these warriors, they're not ready for what we're about ready to unleash on them if God's in it, right? But the whole community began to talk about stoning Joshua and Caleb. And then the glorious presence of the Lord appeared to all the Israelites at the tabernacle. And then God's like, he's like, okay, how long do I got to put up with you disobedient people? How long do I, like, come on, guys. And then God's actually, he gets to the place where he's like, all right, if we're not going to do this, if you guys, like, I'll just do away with you as people. Moses, I'll make you a new nation. We'll start a whole new nation. We'll do this all over again. Like, God's ready to just like, all right, let's go. They aren't going to do it. I got this thing. If they're just going to run like this, we're just going to move right along, and we're not going to do this. But they, Moses pleads with God. And so what you start seeing here is that your choice of faith or fear impacts those you love, right? Like, if God's calling you to do something and you step out in faith, you're like, yeah, let's do this. Like, we can't help but win because we got God. Like, if God's doing it, God's the one doing the work, he doesn't lose. We can't help. Or you can say, you know what? There's no way God can win at this. There's no way we're going to succeed. Like, what you do when you're faced with those, as a follower of Jesus, when you're faced with those situations, those difficult situations, how you respond, whether it's in faith or in fear, changes everyone around you. It's like we don't live in a vacuum. We don't live in a place where like we can just make our decision. Like, what I decide affects you guys. What you guys decide and do affects me. Like, we're together as the body of Christ together. When we're following Christ or not following Christ, it impacts all of us. I saw this really interesting study online the other day, which like a psychological study, because those are fun, right? When you study people mentally and they don't know you're studying them. They took and like somebody was walking, they picked somebody at random, and they were walking, and they either had a hot coffee or a cold coffee in their hand, like in the setup. And so somebody's walking along with a hot coffee, they come across some unsuspecting volunteer, and they say, hey, can you hold this for a second? I need to tie my shoe. So they hand them the cup of coffee and they tie their shoe. They handed some of them hot coffee, some of them a cold coffee. They tie their shoe, they get back up, say thank you, they take their coffee, and they move on about their day. Okay? Person has no idea they're being studied. A little bit later, a few seconds later, somebody else comes up to him and says, hey, we're doing a study on this story. Can you just read this like 4 or 5 paragraph story real quick and then answer a couple questions? And they say, sure. So they hand him the clipboard with the story on it. They read the story, and then they ask him, did you find the lead character in the story as like a warm personality or a cold personality? You know what's crazy? 80% went with what the temperature of the coffee was that they were handed. 80%. They had no idea that the two things were related. But like, if you handed somebody a warm coffee, everybody found that character in the story, totally unrelated, as a warm character. When they handed somebody a cold coffee, they found that character as a cool personality or like kind of distant. And so what the study is, they're finding like that things that are around us impact us. And so when people are around us, like, I don't know, I don't think we can do this. Do you know what starts growing in a group? I don't know, I don't think we can do this. But when some people are like, yeah, we can't help but win because God's doing it, faith starts building around us. And so what we do impacts those around us. And the Israelites are no different. They have consequences because of this. So God's saying, you know what, let's not do this whole thing. I'm going to get rid of them. And Moses pleads on their behalf through the next paragraph or two. And he says, you know what, God, don't kill them all off. Don't push the reset button. You care about these people. And so God actually agrees with Moses and says, yeah, I'm not going to do this. And then verse 20, jumping down verse 20, then the Lord says, I will pardon them as you have requested, but as surely as I live, and as surely as the earth is filled with the Lord's glory, not one of these people will ever enter the land. Right? Not just the 12, but the whole Israelite camp, because they sided with the 10. God says, you know what, they're not going to get it. I was going to give them this land. It was full of milk and honey. It was good. All they had to do was just obey. I had already won the battles for them. But you know what? They're not going to ever see it. They have all seen my glorious presence and the miraculous signs I performed both in Egypt. He's like, they saw me in the Red Sea. They saw the 10 plagues. They saw everything I've done, and now that they still don't, whatever. That, you know what? I'll forgive them, but they don't get to go in. They've tested me again by refusing to listen to my voice. So they will never see the land I swore to give their ancestors. None of those who have treated me with contempt will ever see it. But my servant Caleb, who has had a different attitude than the others, he's remained loyal to me. So I will bring him into the land as he explored, and his descendants will possess the land. Now turn around, don't go towards the land where the Amalekites, the Canaanites live. Tomorrow you must set out for the wilderness and go back to the direction of the Red Sea. So as you go on, you read that Joshua and Caleb, the two, like Joshua ends up leading them in. Moses doesn't never get to see the promised land. But Joshua and Caleb, because they had faith, God still uses them to lead the Israelites in, but not that group of Israelites. So God says, you know what? Go back, turn around to the Red Sea. Go back to the desert. You didn't want paradise. Go back to the desert. God ends up sending a plague, and the 10 spies that rebelled, they end up dying of a plague. And everybody sees it. And so now they're in this situation where they're not allowed to go into the promised land because God withholds blessings when we withhold obedience. Right? Like, I am convinced the longer I live and the longer I follow God, like, I'm not a get-rich-quick guy, a prosperity gospel, but there is something to, like, when we're obedient to God, God just naturally dwells in the realm of blessings. Like, there's nothing that God gives that in the grand scheme of right and wrong and good, like, God is a God that's generous. He's blessings. He's full of, like, good things. And when you're following him and he's asking you to do things, it's not necessarily easy. Like, it's not easy to go kill off all the giants. It's not easy to do these things. But when you walk in obedience to God, he gives blessings. But when we choose to not say yes to God, he will withhold the blessings. God withholds blessings from us when we withhold our obedience to him. And so when God's calling us to do things, it's important to say yes, whether it makes sense or not, whether it seems impossible or not. Because in God's will for your life, that's where true blessing exists. The good things God has for us to do require us to trust him. God has good for us to walk into. Not necessarily easy, but good. But it requires us to trust him, and it requires us to say yes in obedience. And the outcome of these Israelites, because they didn't, is they didn't get to see the promised land. They had to go back to the wilderness. In fact, Yahweh says, because you didn't go in, there was 40 days that the spies were in the land, so for 40 years you got to go wander in the wilderness till all the old people die. But your kids get to go in. Verse 34, because you're the men, explored the land for 40 days, you must wander in the wilderness for 40 years, a year for each day, suffering the consequences of your sins. Sin always has consequences. You know that? I've never seen sin in my life not come with a consequence. Then you will discover what it's like to have me as an enemy. I, the Lord, have spoken. I will certainly do those things to every member of the community who has conspired against me. They will be destroyed here in the wilderness, and they will die. But then the 10 men Moses had sent to explore the land, the ones who incited the rebellion against the Lord with their bad report, they were struck dead with a plague before the Lord. Of the 12 who had gone in to explore the land, only Joshua and Caleb remained alive. Of course, the Israelites are seeing this, right? So when Moses reported the Lord's words to all the Israelites, the people were filled with grief. I bet. So then they got up early the next morning, went to the top of the range of the hills. Let's go, they said. We realize we've sinned, but now we're ready to take the land that the Lord's promised. They're like, okay, well, fine. You know what? Yeah, we were wrong. Let's go do it. Now they got faith, right? But not because God told them to, but because they got this on their own. They go to actually do this on their own. And Moses says, no, don't. Like God said, go out to the Red Sea, but they think they can override God again because they're so much smarter than him. Verse 41, but Moses said, why are you now disobeying the Lord's orders to return to the wilderness? It won't work. Don't go up into the land now. You'll only be crushed by your enemies because the Lord is not with you. And when you face the Amalekites, the Canaanites in battle, you will be slaughtered. The Lord will abandon you because you have abandoned the Lord. Don't try and outrun God's discipline. Don't try and circumvent what God has said. Don't think that like now all of a sudden you can pull a fast one on God. But the people defiantly pushed ahead toward the hill country, even though neither Moses nor the Ark of the Lord's covenant left the camp. God's presence wasn't with them. Then the Amalekites and the Canaanites who lived in the hills came down and attacked them and chased them back as far as Hormah. It didn't work. So here they are. They lose sight of what God has. They try to outsmart God. They think, you know what? I don't want to deal with the punishment that God's given me for my disobedience. And so now I'm going to actually try and, okay, God, yeah, let's do this anyway. Like, it just doesn't work. You can't game God. And so here's, like, they missed their opportunity, and actually God moved on to the next generation. It was sad for them. Now, for the next 40 years, they're in the wilderness, and we're going to look at some fun stuff that happened in the wilderness while they were there and what God does to get them ready to go again, to send them back in. But as we look at this story of sadness, actually, like, they missed out on the blessings of God because they didn't want to say yes to him. Then they tried to go on their own apart from him, and then they failed. Like when we look at this story of actually tragedy, it forces us to kind of wrestle with some things in our life. Now, this is before Jesus came, right? Because Jesus comes through the Israelites, and later on, about 1,000 years later, he does what he does, like with his death, burial, and resurrection. Like, so the covenant's different. But when we look back at this Old Testament story, there's some things that we can take and we can put into our lives. And so here's the thing I want us to wrestle with a little bit. Don't lose sight of the mission. Like, they had their mission. Our mission isn't to go kill giants there, right? Like, our that's not our mission, but God does have things for us to do post-Christ. Like, God is unleashing Eden. God, through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, is unleashing and making open this redemption inheritance to all the people group mission. And so if we're in the church, we're now part of this people group that God is using to redeem humanity. And so we have a mission. Just like they had a mission, we have a mission. And it's to tell people about the good news. It's to be active participants in this gospel. It's to take up, like, not flippantly, not, kind of maybe I'll do it this week, maybe not. Like, it's to be on point. It's to be on mission, to recognize that God has something for us to do. And so if your faith is in Jesus and you're part of, like, this mission people, this redemption, this process of how God is reclaiming Eden, don't lose sight of that. Live as if the mission is important. Because when they thought the mission wasn't important, they thought God wasn't in it with them, it looked too impossible, they just bailed, and it cost them. Now, God isn't going to send you a plague if you don't say yes. man, you're going to miss out on the greatest relationship ever. You're going to miss out on all the great things God has for you. And so don't lose sight of the mission of being part of the reclamation of Eden. We're all part of this. If your faith is in Jesus Christ, you're part of this mission. If your faith isn't in Jesus Christ, it's a great night to join the mission and put your faith in Christ. But if you want God working in your life, if you want to see big things, you have to be doing it through what the work is that God's doing, because that's where God's doing big things. You're not going to see miracles. You're not going to see amazing works in your life if you're not following the leading of where God's taking you to be. In the leading of God, under the mission of God, as He's reclaiming Eden, like there's some great things that God's calling you to do, some battles He's having you maybe face to get ready to win. But apart from that, you're not going to find any real purpose in life. And so that's my challenge. Stay on mission. Stay at the place where you're willing to say no to other things so you can say yes to Jesus. Because you can't say yes to everything. So say yes to Jesus and His mission. Jesus, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the fact that you did put a big mission upon us, that you've done the work of the gospel. You've heard the good news. But now the work is on us to go out and share the good news, to tell people that you are the victor, to tell people that they don't have to live in bondage. So God, I pray that as a church we would live in faith, that we don't have to worry about facing whatever the big giant might be, any kind of thing that's saying, hey, you can't do this. This is too big. You can't win whatever it is. Like if you're calling us to do it, God, you've already won the battle. We just need to walk in that. God, I pray that we would be a church that is full of faith and not fear. A church that's so full of faith that it impacts those not just inside the church, but those outside the church. Not just those inside Renewal, but those in our neighborhood and in our city and in our world. God, our faith would be so big that you've won the battle, that we are just walking in the spoils of war, that we're just walking in the victory that you've already won, God. I know that that's scary at times, and I know that takes faith, but God, I pray that that would be true of us as a church, that we would be a church that is so full of faith that fear isn't even in the conversation. God, I pray that we would be a church that stays on mission in telling people about the reclamation of Eden.